everyone, and welcome to the Tulsa World Opinion podcast. I am here with Representative John Waldron of Tulsa's House District 77. Hello.
Hello, how are you today?
Fine, and you've been very busy. For those of you who don't know, Representative Waldron, former educator, he spends a lot of time on education issues, and so you have been at interim studies this past week, a special session that wasn't really, and you wrote an op-ed for us this weekend, so thank you for that. And his op-ed is already online, and it will be in print Sunday. So I wanted to, and the op-ed is about the A to F report card, which we'll talk about. But before we get started on the details of that, can you just kind of explain what an interim study is and like how these came to be, the ones that you were involved in?
Sure. And first of all, Ginny, thank you very much for having me on the podcast again. It's always great to be here. Okay, so an interim study is an academic legislator's delight. It's a chance to bring in experts to talk about a policy area and bring up information that could be useful in developing effective legislation. We do it by committees. Let individual legislators sign up for the chance to do an interim study. Then they invite guests in to talk about their issue. For example, I did one on school lunches and another one on the ADF report card for our schools. We bring experts in, members of the committee get to ask them questions, and we advance our understanding of policy issues. In theory, it's a way to to design evidence-based legislation because you bring in the experts educate you, and you come out ready to write good laws. Okay,
so the first one you got in was last week, and I missed watching it. There was a lot going on last week. You had one on the A to F report card, and I have to admit, I hate this thing. I have hated it since it was put into place. And for those of you who don't know, the A to F report card is basically just that. It labels a school with one grade. You're an A school, you're an F school. And I don't like it because I do remember a time before that where we had dashboards where, you know, I could pull up my school and see everything from how many emergency certified teachers there are to free to reduce lunch to the test scores. And that gave me the information, but it didn't label the school.
Right.
And that seemed to be a better situation. But then we moved into this weird labeling. And I've never liked the idea of it having one grade because our students aren't an F kid. No, they have lots of grades, you know. So anyway, why did you want to have this interim study, and what are you looking for?
Well, first of all, I want to thank my partner, Republican legislator Ronnie Johns, for co-authoring the study with me. It was a bipartisan study. He brought in his experts, I brought in mine. And the first piece of legislation I filed in 2019 would have been to remove the letter grades from our school report cards. Here's why I'm concerned about that. We do have to evaluate our schools. We need an assessment system, and it's required by the federal government under the Every School Succeeds Act. But the federal government merely requires us to identify 5% of the schools which, for various reasons, are at the bottom of performance indicators so that they can receive targeted support and intervention. The federal law asks us to identify schools that are facing particular challenges so we can target them for additional supports. And that support comes in the form of federal dollars for a school improvement. The state of Oklahoma complied with that law, but also overlaid it with a system called the A to F, in which they use test scores, attendance, post-secondary achievement opportunities, and other things, primarily designed for the Title I schools, but really applying to every school and giving every school an A, B, C, D, or F. So I want you to consider the difference in language. The federal government sees a school at the bottom end of the scale and says, this is a school that needs targeted support. The state looks and says, this is a failing school. And we develop policies accordingly, and often those policies are punitive. This is a big problem, too, because many of the factors that will tend to push a school down the range, like problems with chronic absenteeism, let's see, having challenging student populations. For example, students who speak a second language at home, economically disadvantaged students. The schools that are going to have the most of these critical subgroups that are going to propose extra challenges for the school are going to be often in our poorest neighborhoods. So there's going to be this correlation between F schools and schools in high poverty areas. If we develop a punitive approach to that, we're basically punishing schools for having a lot of poor kids in them that maybe speak different languages, that maybe have a lot of adverse childhood experiences they're dealing with, that are facing maybe a lot of barriers to learning. And we're blaming the school for the social conditions that they meet when those students come in the door.
And it's always been the case with test scores. I mean, since for decades, the schools with the lowest test scores have social factors that they're bringing to school. And one of the things that gets me about this, and I remember reporter Andrea Eager in 2014, so we're going back a decade, she spent a lot of time at Hawthorne Elementary, which was labeled an F school. Yeah. And there were so many things that stuck with me from that are still today, but there's a psychological aspect to that when you are a kid in that neighborhood school, going to a school where there's an F on and you have to post it on your door, that harms a kid psychologically. They think they're lesser than. And the other things that stood out was the amount of work going into those schools. Those teachers, they are putting in 70 hours of work a week because you have to have before school, after school. Well, they're not getting paid for it, so they volunteer. They're paying out of their own pocket for things. Because you're right. The state isn't necessarily giving extra money for that. So I don't know if that's something that was explored in the interim study, but just how psychologically it just feeds upon itself.
Yeah, my colleague Melissa Provenzano, who was a principal at a school on that needs improvement list, talked about the psychological impact when a student comes in and sees that grade. It is disappointing, dispiriting. It does reinforce feelings of insecurity for many students, and it undermines the value we place in education at schools. Like I taught at an A school, Booker T, but I can't say that I worked harder or achieved better results than a teacher at Hawthorne Elementary. I was just working with different materials. So I want to thank you for letting me for printing my op-ed in the paper this week. I always put a catchy title on them that I'm not sure always appears in the Tulsa World. But the title of this week's op-ed is A is for Affluent, because you see, that's kind of part of the problem.
I left that headline on there. We'll see if the designer.
God bless you, Ginny. Thank you.
Well, what
I put a lot of effort into my titles.
Well, your interim study was this past week. Were there some experts or some things that were brought to your attention that either reinforce what you said, or maybe you didn't know that gives you a different perspective on it?
Yeah, there were a lot of great things that came up in that study. Rob Miller, the superintendent of Bixby Public Schools, talked about how his district is economically in a different set of circumstances than inner city Tulsa. His schools do tend to perform well, but he downplays the letter grades on his schools, even when those are good grades. And instead, he focuses on things like community building, respect, teamwork, and meeting the needs of the students as they come in the door, because he knows that meeting those basic needs of a school in tangible and intangible ways generates the results you want. If you just focus on the letter grade, you're going to teach to the test, you're going to disempower your teachers. It's going to have a lot of negative consequences. And he uses this wonderful analogy about popcorn. When you put popcorn kernels in the microwave, some of them are going to pop early, some are going to pop in the middle, some are going to pop at the end, and some are never going to pop at all. But you have to recognize that a school is going to have all these kernels in it. They're all going to have different needs, and it's not fair to put a single letter on a school because of the content of popcorn kernels that they might be dealing with.
So what do you think the appetite is in the legislature for actually changing that? Because there's always pushback because people, I don't know, that they like that simplicity, even though it doesn't tell us anything. I mean, a school's a C school, that tells me nothing about what the school's like.
Right.
So what's the appetite in the legislature for actually improving that?
There are two schools of thought, I think. One of them is, I think, motivated by the data, the evidence, the expertise of people in the field, like our superintendents. All the superintendents who came in on Monday talked about the problems of the system. So yeah, there is a real appetite to change the system, unless you simply want a clear letter that can show you who to blame. And I think that came out in the committee too. We had one member of the committee was like, well, we don't need to protect the feelings of educators who are failing their students in their failing school, and and this is a political correctness. Pardon me for characterizing this anonymous legislator in that way, but my feeling was that he wanted somebody to blame, and he wanted a simple letter, to which I would say there's a very big difference between the federal language, targeted support and improvement, and the Oklahoma language, failing school. And it encourages us to develop a punitive approach. And really, I felt like that legislator kind of proved our point. He wanted to blame teachers. He wanted to show that schools were failing. And so he appreciated the convenience of an F designation. But let me tell you something. There will always be Fs under this system, because the federal government wants us to identify the 5% of schools that are at the bottom of the indicators for targeted support and improvement. Therefore, even if those schools make Herculean efforts and rise up out of the F category, they're just going to let other schools slip into that category.
Right. So it's a bell curve. There will always be failing schools.
There will always be
failing schools. That's a very good point. And that's how test scores work, I found out.
Yeah.
I am learning more about test scores, that these kids that aren't proficient, we will always have kids who aren't proficient because that's how it's designed. I thought it was pass-fail. I was wrong.
No. Jesus said there will always be poor. And Jesus meant that we must always show compassion. Mm-hmm. If we always have F schools, I'm not sure that's encouraging compassion. I think it's the opposite.
Well, it certainly hasn't improved the outcomes, which is bottom line. We've had it around for over a decade. It's not improved outcomes. So we've got to come up with a better system. Right. So the next interim study I want to talk to you about, if you're ready to move on.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is another one that I think is a big issue for me. It's the school lunch program. Mm. And for me, hunger issues is one of my biggest frustrations in this country. I mean, the food waste in our country is like 35, 40%. Yeah. And yet we have in Oklahoma, 1 in 5 kids going hungry.
Yes.
So I know that I remember when TPS was able to have every elementary school have free lunch because of the way they were able to take advantage of the Department of Agriculture's way of, and I couldn't even begin to explain.
It's called the community eligibility provision.
Right. And it was wonderful. Everyone got food if they wanted. Mm-hmm. And so I know that the things changed in the pandemic. What in the interim study did you learn? I mean, how does the school lunch program look across the state? Are there kids with huge school lunch debts? Are there schools that are providing free lunches? I mean, what does it look like?
Okay. Well, the first thing is a district needs to calculate the economic portfolio of the students that attend. And if 40% of the students are qualify for free and reduced lunch, then a school or a district qualifies for community eligibility, in which case the federal government will reimburse them at a particular rate for every student who takes lunch. But that rate doesn't necessarily cover the cost of the lunch, so districts have to budget in their own money for it. Under community eligibility, a district like Tulsa or Oklahoma City can budget how much it's going to cost to feed every kid and then simply feed every kid. And Oklahoma City Public Schools, the second largest district in our state, does it without any lunch debt. Lunch debt is what happens when a kid doesn't pay, the parents of a child don't pay the extra cost that's not reimbursed by the federal government. Lunch debt has quadrupled nationally since the end of pandemic era programs. But Oklahoma City Public Schools, by placing it all under community eligibility provision and planning to feed every kid, has no school lunch debt. Norman Public Schools, regarded as a much more affluent district, has $301,000 in lunch debt. That means they have to contact parents and say, please pay for your lunch. There are stories that some districts will tie a string around a kid's wrist with a note saying, please pay the lunch. And there are other districts which will take kids off the Class A lunch schedule and give them cheese sandwiches and water to sit at a table and eat with their friends receiving regular lunches, as if to say, poor, poor, poor.
Wow. So what's the solution then? This is where obviously we need kids to eat if we want them to do well in school. They're coming to school hungry.
Yeah.
They're leaving hungry.
You ready for the message? We can do it.
So how do we do it? What are some of the things that came up in the study that might be guideposts for us?
Here's something that's really exciting. The United States Department of Agriculture decided this last week to change the standards for the community eligibility provision from 40% down to 25%. A district like Norman with 24 schools had 5 schools that made the cutoff, but they were reluctant to apply community eligibility because then you have kids who in one school, they're getting free lunch, in another school, they aren't. But under the new rules, they can get up to 19 of the 24 schools under community eligibility. It would cost money for them to do so because they have to provide more free lunches. And remember, the federal government doesn't reimburse the entire cost of the lunch. However, the state could raise the threshold of reimbursement they could provide reimbursement for kids up to, say, 250% of the federal poverty level, which would get most of the kids in our public schools. So if we encourage all our districts that qualify, and this is most of them now under the 25% rule, to apply for community eligibility provision, and then we get state funds to meet the difference in cost for those districts so that they're made whole when they feed every kid, then we can eliminate the problem of school lunch debt. We can provide nutritious lunch to build strong bodies and strong minds for our students. And guess what? Here's the kicker. It could cost us as little as $20 or $30 million in a year. $20 or $30 million in a $5.5 billion budget. That's a drop in the bucket. And the benefits of feeding children healthy, nutritious lunches, it's enormous. We had a doctor show the effect of nutrition on brain development. Lots of kids live in poverty today, food insecurity, and the most nutritious meals they get are at school. The healthy eating index shows that a middle schooler in the 80s was scoring something like 50 out of 100 on the scale in school lunches. The number's now 71. Secondary, the numbers are even better. It's like 83 or 87. Our lunches are getting better. They're more nutritious. We've demonstrated that they have a profound impact on student health and learning, and it won't cost us much to do it.
So you talk about quality. You have a high school student, right?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know about yours, but mine will argue about the quality, and that might be a whole other issue. But there are some districts that I've looked at, like Union. They have an outstanding, because some of those school lunch, I remember some, and I see some, and I'm like, I could kind of see where kids, balk at it. But there have been some really interesting things using, especially partnerships with local farmers and local producers to try to get more fresh food. Like I say, Union is one that stands out to me just because they had a nutrition leader who sort of led that charge. And especially when you have something like a pandemic, when you had trouble with food supply chain, if you have some of these local partnerships, it really sort of helped out. So, but the hunger issue is totally solvable in this country.
The answer isn't don't do school lunches, just do good school lunches.
Yeah, and figure out a way to pay for it. It sounds like the federal government is meeting us halfway here.
They are more than halfway. They're dropping the number from 40 to 25. They're meeting us 3/4 of the way.
Okay, so the last thing that caught my attention, and it got me kind of riled up, was the corporal punishment. So Oklahoma Appleseed did a really good report. I'm sure you read. We've linked it online. And hey, Oklahoma's number 5 in school officials hitting our kids.
Top 10.
So yay, top 10. But there are some troubling things in there. Black students are hit by this, with violent discipline, as I'm calling it, 2.5 times more than other kids. Indigenous students are tattled at 25% of the total, even though they represent only 13% of the population. And special needs kids, kids
Yes.
who have challenges, they are hit 21% of the total, and they only represent, 16%. And this is just, I see no benefit to corporal punishment.
Yeah.
I was at elementary school that teachers abused it. And I look back, and this was the 80s, and I'm just like, no, it didn't do any good. But you've sat in on these legislative discussions, and the primary opposition, and they've already had a press release out from Representative John Olson from Roland. He argues God has ordained and allows for hitting kids, and it's hard to argue with God. I mean, when you really believe that. But
it's hard to argue with God when you're speaking for God.
I guess. I mean, that's, it's just a lot of biblical verses from him. But there's Representative Randy Randleman from Eufaula, who works with school districts as a psychologist, and he's arguing it's all good. Paddling kids works. And that goes against more than 24 mental health and medical organizations. He cited an OSU researcher who, by everything I've seen, he's in the minority on this. I don't know if you're going to move them, but I mean, is that data going to move other Oklahomans or lawmakers into actually thinking, maybe hitting kids in school doesn't change the long-term outcome?
Well, we had 2 members out of 101 in the House who took strong positions for hitting kids last year. And not just kids, hitting kids with special needs was the area of debate in our bill, in John Talley's excellent bill, which I was happy to co-author last year. 2% of the legislators got to be at least 50% of the argument, and they swayed enough people to kill a bill against paddling disabled children.
Right, because that was just for, you can't paddle kids who are disabled.
That's
or on special needs.
We eventually did manage to get a bill passed that said you couldn't paddle the severely disabled children, believe it or not. But even that didn't clear the Senate, because the Senate did not want to have the same bruising debate where somebody who represents perhaps 1% of the psychological field gets to 100% of the psychologists speaking on the floor. Or somebody who read only one book of the Bible, the Old Testament, and seems to apply that to every experience after I don't know, Samuel and David, and to make that the dominant thing. Now, our legislature wants to do the right thing, but when they're asked to choose between biblical values that they hear about on Sundays and the psychological experience of one person, who I would say, I agree with you, represents the minority opinion on the thing, we gave a lot of legislators cover to do the wrong thing last year when we voted on paddling. So we thought we would do a nice, reasonable interim study where we bring out the evidence and make the case for why paddling is ineffective, why it hurts rather than helps our schools, and why other methods can do a better job. And as things go, we saw these views, the Old Testament, spare the rod and spoil the child, and this, and this.
Yeah, I mean, the research it's overwhelming that this is harmful.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
It's harmful psychologically. It's harmful academically.
Yep.
And the Oklahoma Appleseed report shows that it is targeting minority kids. My own experience was that it targeted poor kids.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the kids that lived in the nice big houses weren't paddled. It was the kids from the trailer park.
Yeah.
It's like, it's kind of goes back to that test score thing. It's the easy solution for challenging behaviors.
Right.
And it's ineffective. At the bottom line, it's ineffective.
Yes.
It's not improved our outcomes. And we're number 5. So, but here's the other thing that I don't understand is why risk it? Like, you're talking about allowing other people, this isn't parents spanking. We're talking about you're allowing another person to hit your kid.
This is about government spankers.
Right. This is about you're allowing a government person to hit your child.
Right.
Why would any district risk that? I mean, you're risking a lawsuit if you bruise a kid. I mean, or you're risking traumatizing this kid, stigmatizing this kid. Why would and there are districts doing that. Do Do you have insight as to why educators would do that?
I think what we need to do is look at which districts are doing it, and it's widespread. It's more of a rural thing than an urban thing. And I think it runs contrary to the notion that we don't want to co-parent with the government. I mean, if we don't want to trust teachers to teach history, why do we want to trust them to beat children on behalf of the parents? It just doesn't make any sense, and it has no place in the 21st century. And it's unfortunate that a small number of legislators are able to sway so much argument in the Oklahoma legislature. I'm hopeful we'll do better this session.
I was going to ask if you think that this interim study is going to make a difference. I mean, I know that Representative Olson and Randleman are already calling this one-sided, but I mean, their arguments basically roll down to God and I don't like the research.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, I think there was a lot of money for a long time in being the one guy who argued that climate change wasn't real. What do y'all think about that now, Oklahoma?
So I always appreciate our talk. I wanted to get a roundup of everything education being talked about, even though you're not in session.
Yeah.
There's still a lot happening. Anything else we should know about with what's going on with education at the Capitol?
Well, I think there's a lot of concern, of course, about what the state superintendent is doing, and he's going to continue to throw firebombs and distract us from, his latest failing in the State Department. I don't think there's any appetite to do anything about it until he's charged with a felony. So I think that's the thing that people might want to look at. We're hopeful to do the right thing for public education. We have in the last 5 years made great strides forward, but also against considerable headwinds: the pandemic, the lockdown, inflation, the teacher shortage. So we still have a lot of work to do. And I think it's going to come down to whether we listen to the better angels of our nature and uphold teachers and encourage respect for them, because we know that when people respect teachers, they respect society and community better. And I hope we continue to make investments in public education and not just try to divert resources to private schools, as we're doing with this voucher program. So I think we have a lot more good work to do. And I hope that the people who know that get to have the commanding voice in our arguments, and not the people who want to blame and shame our schools or use corporal punishment against disabled children or deny a hungry kid a good nutritious lunch.
Well, I appreciate that. Are there is there any sense of when the 8F report cards are coming out? Because they seem to be.
They're a couple months out if things run on schedule. And who knows with the State Department today. We have federal guidelines to get those numbers out, but we seem to have lost a lot of employees in the State Department of Education. And here's something to look out for, by the way. I don't think there are any directors of departments in the State Department anymore. They've all been, titles have been changed to program managers, which I think de-emphasizes their professional expertise and maybe their job security. So I'll be interested to see how things continue to operate inside the Hodges building, the State Department of Education, because it's getting harder to get good data out of this agency that represents our biggest appropriation on the budget. And without good data, it's hard to make smart policy on education. So I'd be concerned about that.
Well, thank you. And as always, any last words as we sign off here?
Feed the kids. Honor the schools.
Well, I fed the teachers this morning at my kids' school. They are hungry teachers. Feed the teachers too.
Feed the teachers too. They're wonderful people and they deserve our respect. And please put the paddle down, sir.
Yes. No paddles at school. Thank you very much. We'll have you on again to talk education. I appreciate it.
Always nice to see you, Ginnie. Take care.